In this episode of Aerospace Engineer Explains, I am ranking every single operational fighter and attack aircraft. First, I'm going to explain the system that I developed that allows me to compare any aircraft type from any era. After that brief introduction, we're going to analyze the Russian manufactured fighter and attack aircraft. Following the Russian aircraft, we're going to rank the US aircraft, which I have updated a couple of their rankings, so make sure you stay tuned to the end to see their updated ranking, taking into more consideration their combat record. Following the US aircraft, we're going to go into the Chinese manufactured fighter jets, and to close us out, we're going to go into the European manufactured fighter jets.
This system is broken into 5 different categories. Each of those categories will be assigned a score based on metrics of that category of 1 to 10, 10 being the best in that category. And those 5 categories are cost, speed, innovation, versatility, and effectiveness. And you'll notice that each category is only given a certain weight of the score because some of these categories are more important than others. For instance, I only attributed 5% of the total score to cost because sometimes militaries don't really care about the cost of things. But it certainly is a factor in the long-term longevity of a program. When assigning a score to the cost category, I first look at the cost of when it was purchased, and then I use an inflation calculator to get the cost in today's terms. After I get this figure, I take this number and compare it to similar aircraft with similar capabilities in the same class. Next, we have the speed category, and the speed category takes up 10% of the overall score of the aircraft, and I use the speed when compared to similar aircraft in the same class in the same era in which that aircraft was developed. For example, it wouldn't be fair for me to compare an aircraft such as the P-51 to the F-22 because the F-22 was developed long after the P-51, and the P-51 was developed before the sound barrier was even broken. The next category is versatility. Versatility accounts for 30% of the aircraft's total score. An aircraft is scored in this category based on its ability to perform a variety of different tasks within its class. For instance, the F-18 Super Hornet scores excellently in this category because it can perform a wide variety of tasks. It can be a carrier-borne aircraft, it can perform attack roles, bombing runs, and even air-to-air combat. Whereas certain aircraft such as the A380 do not score as well in versatility because they can only perform one set of tasks. The A380 cannot be converted into a cargo aircraft because of the way that it was designed. This drastically limits its capability as an aircraft in the commercial class. The next category is innovation, and it also comes in at 30% of the overall aircraft score. The innovation category of an aircraft basically means how much this aircraft advanced aviation as a whole. For instance, the SR-71 will score exceptionally high in this category because it pushed aerospace in such a dramatic fashion. The sheer amount of technologies that went into developing the SR-71 were absolutely astounding. And so innovation is very high in the SR-71. For the innovation category, we're going to be looking at specific metrics such as range, thrust to weight ratio, fuel capacity, payload capacity, all of these specific measures that are good metrics for seeing how innovative that aircraft was when compared to similar aircraft in the same class. Another important aspect of innovation is looking at the technology that was developed for the aircraft or new technology that was implemented into the aircraft. For example, the F-117 was the first stealth fighter jet. This is an incredible example of innovation and reducing radar cross-section. And if you don't know what that means, make sure you check out my video all about stealth aircraft, right there. The last category included in this ranking is effectiveness. Effectiveness is pretty much what it sounds like. It's basically how successful an aircraft was. It's also important to note that the score of the effectiveness of this aircraft is only used when comparing other aircraft in its class. So some metrics that can help us gauge what the effectiveness score of an aircraft should be will be how many units were produced, how long the aircraft was operational, the combat record of an aircraft, and its overall durability.
Before we get too far into the analysis, I just want to state for the record, based on a lot of the feedback I got on my previous video with the European fighter jets, I do want to say that this is not a ranking of who will win a dogfight. This is not who the best aircraft is today if it were to fly in a one-on-one fight. This is an overall ultimate ranking system. Essentially what this means is this is not a ranking of what the better aircraft is, because I think that would be a really boring ranking system, to be honest. Obviously, the most modern fighter is going to be the best fighter. So that would mean that it's just going to be a chronological list of what the most recent aircraft is. And that doesn't really tell us anything. Instead, I developed this specifically designed ultimate aircraft ranking system to cross-analyze all aircraft of any type and from any era. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and rank every operational fighter and attack aircraft in the Russian Air Force, starting with the oldest aircraft, the Su-24, which first flight took place in 1974. The Su-24 is a variable sweep wing fighter bomber designed for ground attack missions. The Su-24's contributions to the conflict have emphasized its value in delivering precision strikes on target. However, its vulnerabilities to modern air defenses have revealed the need for much more advanced platforms that can operate effectively in high-threat environments like we're seeing in Ukraine. The Su-24 was highly produced and is a multi-role attack aircraft, not really designed for air-to-air combat. For the category of cost, the Su-24 gets a 7, coming in at about $25 million inflation adjusted, being a pretty good value for what you're getting out of the aircraft. As for the category of speed, the top speed of the Su-24 is approximately Mach 1.6, but it definitely loses a lot of points for its low thrust to weight ratio of 0.6 and a pretty low climb rate, pretty much one of the lowest on this list at about 30,000 feet per minute. It has to get a 6 for speed, taking under consideration other aircraft from this generation with much better climb rates, better thrust to weight ratios, and higher top speeds. For versatility, it gets a 6 for its slightly above average number of hard points at 9. Its ability is in air-to-ground operations, but definitely loses points for its combat range at around 382 miles. For innovation, there's not too much to report, but it is a pretty capable aircraft, so this gets a 5 for innovation. The variable sweep wings is always a cool innovation, however, it had been done previously on other aircraft. And finally, for the category of effectiveness, it also gets a 5, given the fact that it doesn't have an incredibly stellar record, despite the fact that it has been a very good selling platform for Russia, with about 400 units in operation and over 1,400 produced in its lifetime, being in operation in countries such as Ukraine, Sudan, Syria, Russia, Libya, Iran, Belarus, and Algeria. And that gives the total weighted average score of the Su-24 5.50. And next up on our list is the MiG-31, Russia's advanced interceptor aircraft. The MiG-31 does have pretty extraordinary speed and interception capabilities and has played a vital role in the conflict in Ukraine. Its efficiency in neutralizing threats from a distance underscores the significance of this role in a modern conflict. The MiG-31 has showcased the unique balance of speed, power, and strategic prowess demanded in the high-stakes theater of modern warfare. Notably, the MiG-31 has a much better climb rate at about 56,700 feet per minute and a thrust-to-weight ratio of about 0.85. But what really sets the MiG-31 apart is the speed. This is one of the fastest production aircraft ever assembled, coming in at a top speed of about Mach 2.83. I did want to highlight two specific innovations in this aircraft that really set this apart, especially for the era this aircraft was first developed. It was one of the first aircraft to have a phased array radar, and it's one of 2 aircraft capable of firing long-range air-to-air missiles currently in operation. This can be a huge advantage, especially in a contested airspace like over Ukraine. For cost coming in at about $33 million inflation adjusted, the MiG-31 gets a score of 7. For speed, as I mentioned earlier, it's one of the fastest production aircraft ever manufactured, and certainly one of the fastest currently in operation. It gets a 9. For versatility, again, this is a pretty potent part of the Russian military. It gets a score of 6 for versatility, not really having too many air-to-air capabilities. However, given its incredible speed and ability to fire from long ranges, it gets a 6. And as I alluded to earlier, the MiG-31 really stands out as far as innovation goes, with its implementation of phased array radar and its current implementation of weapons such as long-range air-to-air missiles, and notably recently with its ability to launch the Kinzhal hypersonic air-launched ballistic missile. it gets an 8 for innovation. As for effectiveness, given its ability to really make a difference in contested airspace, it gets a 7 as well. That gives the MiG-31 an overall score of a respectable 7.20. Next up, we have our first true air superiority aircraft we talk about today, the MiG-29. The MiG-29 is the 4th gen fighter jet designed specifically for air superiority. The MiG-29's capabilities really have been tested in the Ukrainian conflict, revealing both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. It has a respectable max speed of Mach 2.25. Its performance in Ukraine has really shed light on the fact that more advanced aircraft are really needed to navigate the complex nature of modern air combat. For cost, the MiG-29 comes in at about $20 million inflation adjusted, which makes sense when you look at the long list of aircraft operators such as Uzbekistan, Ukraine, Turkmenistan, Syria, Sudan, Serbia, Russia, and the list goes on. But overall, about 1,600 MiG-29s have been produced and sold by Russia, and that's a pretty significant number for any aircraft platform, especially considering fighter jets. As mentioned earlier, it's a pretty fast aircraft, coming in at over Mach 2.25, gives it a speed score of 8, also sporting a very sporty 65,000 feet per minute climb rate, fantastic thrust to weight ratio of 1.09. It's clear the MiG-21 has some get up and go, which is why the MiG-29 gets an 8 for speed. For versatility, the MiG-29 has the ability to perform a wide range of roles, including air superiority and ground operations. It has a respectable 8 hard points for ground operations. As mentioned earlier, it has a good number of capabilities for versatility. It has an okay combat range of about 890 miles. That gives the versatility of the MiG-29 a score of 7. For innovation, the MiG-29 has really shown itself in its maneuverability and speed. As I mentioned, the stats for speed are self-evident. However, what really doesn't show up too much in the stats is the super maneuverability of the MiG-29. This is a very capable aircraft, and its ability to navigate in close combat airspaces really shows itself. But overall, the MiG really lacks in avionics and specific technological advancements. There's not too much to report here, and so ultimately the innovation has to get a 7. But what really kills the MiG-29 score is its effectiveness. The MiG-29 really has a poor performance in combat record, sporting only 6 air kills but 18 air-to-air losses. The downside of having such a highly produced aircraft is when being able to see it perform in a wide variety of theaters, and it has not performed as well as Russia would have liked. And that of course does not include the current conflict, which are highly contested numbers, but some reports indicate that Ukraine has lost at least 22 MiG-29s. That gives the overall effectiveness of the MiG-29 a score of 4. This gives the MiG-29 an overall score of 6.35. Next up, we have another air superiority aircraft, the Su-27. Another 4th generation fighter designed for air superiority, the Su-27's agility capabilities have really been demonstrated in the Ukrainian conflict. It also has a similar top speed of around Mach 2.35, but unlike the MiG-29, it actually has a positive air-to-air combat ratio, with more air-to-air kills than losses. Although some would say that this combat record is dubious at best, given the fact that it was used in the Ethiopian-Eritrean War, and it was a very lopsided conflict, let's just say. Despite the fact that the Su-27's first flight took place the same year as the MiG-29, it sports a lot more developmental advances, such as fly-by-wire. This of course translated to a much more costlier platform, coming in at about $47 million, which is more than double what the MiG-29 cost, but also given the fact that it had much more advanced electronics and was generally seen as a more capable aircraft, it scores a 6 on cost. Similar to the MiG-29, it has similar top speeds and a similar thrust to weight ratio of 1.07. It has a slightly lower climb rate than the MiG-29 does at 59,000, but pretty comparable, all things considered. That gives the Su-27 a speed score of 8. For versatility, the Su-27 has 10 hardpoints, 3 more than the MiG-29, and is able to carry out a wide variety of roles such as air-to-ground attack and air superiority missions. It has a similar combat range as the MiG-29 at about 930 miles. However, the ferry range dwarfs the MiG-29s, coming in at 2,190 miles. That gives the overall versatility of the Su-27 a score of 7. As I alluded to earlier, the innovation on the Su-27 was also much more advanced than the MiG-29, sporting equipment such as fly-by-wire and electronically steered array radar and more advanced early warning radar, giving the Su-27 overall innovation score of 8. As for effectiveness, the Su-27 has the combat record to back it up. Although it hasn't been quite as produced as the MiG-29, this is more likely due to the fact that it is much more expensive of an aircraft, but given its combat record has generally been untouched, if you exclude the ongoing Ukrainian conflict, of course. That gives the Su-27 an effectiveness score of 8, but as more reports come in and become less disputed, this may fluctuate. That gives the Su-27 honestly a very respectable score of 7.6. Next up we have the Su-25, a close air support aircraft designed for ground attack missions. The Su-25's involvement in the Ukrainian conflict highlights its role as a workhorse, providing close air support for troops on the ground. However, its susceptibility to enemy air defenses underscores the evolving nature of modern warfare. However, its susceptibility to enemy air defenses really highlights the fact that advanced aircraft are really essential to modern air combat, especially in a highly contested airspace with a near-peer foe. Needless to say, my research into the Su-25's capabilities did not impress. For instance, it has an abysmal ferry range of only 640 miles. It is one of the cheapest on this list, but it also has the lowest ceiling of any aircraft on my ranking list to date. It has one of the most disappointing combat records of any aircraft on this list as well, sporting exactly 0 air kills, which shouldn't be expected of any attack aircraft, but the fact that it has 61 ground losses shows how incredibly susceptible this aircraft is to any enemy air defenses. The Su-25, of course, is one of the most affordable aircraft on this list, inflation adjusted, coming in at about $11 million, giving it a score of 8. Similar to other aircraft we've discussed previously on this list, there's been over 1,000 aircraft produced and currently 192 in operation, likely due to the fact that it is such an affordable aircraft. As you may have guessed already by its air combat record, the Su-25 is no speed demon. It comes in at an approximate top speed of around Mach 0.79. That, combined with its low climb rates and low thrust to weight ratio of 0.62, that gives it a speed score of 4. For versatility, this aircraft is pretty single-minded, coming in really to do close air support in non-contested airspaces. Otherwise, this aircraft is not much of an aircraft you want to rely on, so it gets a score of 3 for versatility. Given the fact that it does have 11 hard points, it does pretty much what it was intended to do. For innovation, not too much to write home about. Sorry to anyone that likes the Su-25. I didn't see anything really of note to say for innovation here, so it gets a 3. And effectiveness, we've already pretty much harped enough on this point. It is not a very effective aircraft. I have to say, looking at all of the combat history, the abilities of the Su-25, it kind of feels like cannon fodder for the Russian military, and to anyone that purchased this aircraft, it gets a 3 for effectiveness, giving the Su-25 a pretty pithy score of 3.35. I know if there's Su-25 fans in the comments, I'm gonna hear it. Sorry guys. Next up we have the Su-30, a multi-role air superiority fighter jet that was developed around the time when the F-22 was also being developed, just for context. And it's within that context that we really start to see the gap between the Russian and the US Air Forces. While the US Air Force was defining what it meant to be a 5th generation fighter, with the entrance of the 5th generation with the F-22 and the introduction of stealth technology and a huge leap in engineering that it was, the Su-30 really represents what it meant to be just an improved 4th generation fighter. And that's not to say that the Su-30 doesn't have great features along with it. For instance, it has thrust vectoring nozzles that enable it to be a super maneuverable aircraft. It has recorded 7 air-to-air kills, but on the downside it also has about 15 ground losses. Overall, it's a pretty quick aircraft with a top speed of about Mach 2, but it features a disappointing climb rate of about 45,000 feet per minute compared to the F-22, which has a climb rate of about 69,000 feet per minute. The Su-30 also features 12 hardpoints, which makes it a pretty decent payload, of about 18,000 pounds. For cost, the Su-30 comes in at about $35 million inflation adjusted, which looks like a steal compared to the $177 million inflation adjusted price tag of the F-22. That gives the Su-30 a score of 8 on cost. For speed, it's a pretty quick aircraft like I mentioned earlier, top speed of Mach 2, but it loses a lot of points for its climb rates and relatively low thrust to weight ratio compared to other aircraft in its class, giving a speed score of 6. For versatility, it's a pretty well-rounded aircraft with 12 hard points as I mentioned earlier, and is able to perform a wide variety of combat roles. This gives it a 7 for versatility. For innovation, as I mentioned, it has a good number of innovations, but not as great as when you compare the F-22 that had its first flight only a year after the Su-30's first flights. But its phased array radar and thrust vectoring capabilities gives the Su-30 an overall score for innovation of 7. For effectiveness, as I mentioned earlier, it has an okay combat record with no air losses, however about 15 ground losses and 7 air kills, which is notable given the fact that it is somewhat a modern aircraft and there are not too many modern aircraft that have any air-to-air combat history, so 7 air kills is nothing to look over. That gives the overall effectiveness score of the Su-30 a 7. That brings the weighted score of the Su-30 to a 6.95. The program for this aircraft was significantly delayed. It initially started off as the Su-32 program and was kind of rolled into the Su-34. Its first flight was in 1990 but didn't enter service until 2014. The delays in this program are kind of indicative of the Russian military in general, and obviously the political instability that happened in the early 90s in Russia. And with this aircraft finally entering service in 2014, reading between the lines, you can see why Russia really wanted to update their old platforms and get some new avionics and electronic warfare on a platform with some updated abilities and capabilities. That being said, this program really hasn't been as successful as you would expect for a somewhat modern Russian fighter. Its lack of stealth capabilities and survivability is kind of evident in the fact that we've already seen at least 15 ground losses of the Su-34. For a modern fighter, this actually comes in at a pretty decent price at $36 million inflation adjusted. That gives it an overall cost score of 8. For speed, we actually see that the Su-34 kind of takes a little bit of a dive compared to other iterations of Sukhoi aircraft. We see that it only has a top speed of Mach 1.8 and it has a pretty bad thrust to weight ratio reported at about 0.68. The climb rate leaves a lot to be desired too, with about 45,000 compared to other contemporaries like the Eurofighter, which has a 62,000 feet per minute climb rate, and the F-22, which has a 69,000 feet per minute climb rate. So the Su-34 may not be slow, but it's certainly not the quickest fighter jet we've seen. So it gets a 6 for speed. For versatility, this aircraft really stands out with its hardpoints. Sports about 12 hardpoints, and it has one of the highest payload capacities of any fighter or attack aircraft on this list at about 26,000 pounds. For innovation, this aircraft really doesn't impress. There's not too much advances in technology, especially for an aircraft that entered service in 2014. The avionics are outdated, and it obviously shows its vulnerabilities in innovation, given the fact that it has had so many ground losses already. It gets a 4 for innovation. For effectiveness, as I've mentioned earlier, it really doesn't shine on the battlefield at all, with 15 ground losses already for an aircraft that has barely seen any combat history at all. But they have produced over 150 of them, so it's not a complete failure of a program, I would say. It gets a 4 for effectiveness. That gives the Su-34 an overall score of 5.30. Next up we have the MiG-35, which I kind of debated whether or not I would even bring this up, but it is technically in operation in the Russian Air Force, so I will mention it here, even though there's only about 6 currently in operation and 10 manufactured ever. This is another example of a Russian program that really doesn't look too good, especially when you start looking into the history of the program. There's already been one runway incursion of this aircraft, and it has barely been in operation, and like I said, there's reportedly only about 6 in operation, so that doesn't really bode well for the overall success of the program. Its specs also leave a lot to be desired, although some of them are fairly impressive, with one of Russia's highest climb rates at 65,000 feet per minute, and a pretty good top speed at Mach 2.25. For the MiG-35, we do see an uptick in price, costing about $48.6 million. That gives the MiG-35 a cost score of 7. For speed, as I mentioned, it's got a pretty impressive climb rate of about 65,000 feet per minute. It's got a great top speed of Mach 2.25, so it gets an 8 for speed. As far as versatility goes, it seems kind of middle of the road. Its combat range is kind of what you expect out of a fighter attack aircraft of this era, coming in at about 620 miles. The payload leaves a little bit to be desired, coming in about 14,000 pounds, kind of on the lower end, but as far as hard points, there's about 9, so it's not terrible, not amazing. So it gets a 6 for versatility. For innovation, we start to see the implementation of a couple new technologies added to this platform with the phased array radar that it sports, but it also does not have some of the staples of what makes Russian aircraft innovative. For instance, it does not feature thrust vectoring like other Russian aircraft have. Besides the phased array radar, there's not a lot of innovation that's going into this aircraft. It gets a 4 for innovation. For effectiveness, we really haven't seen it do too much in combat. We haven't seen a lot of aircraft either, so I can't give it too much more than a 5 on effectiveness. That gives the MiG-35 an overall score of 5.40. And finally, we arrive at the Su-35, the most abundant air superiority fighter jet in the Russian Air Force at this time. The Su-35 has everything you would expect out of a 4th generation fighter: phased array radar, thrust vectoring, super maneuverability. Overall, it's a pretty decent aircraft. Its capabilities as a 4th generation fighter has landed it 7 confirmed air kills, making it one of the most successful Russian platforms in operation today. But despite the 7 confirmed air kills in Ukraine, it has lost at least 3 aircraft to Ukrainian forces due to ground fire. And that does not include a friendly fire incident in which Russia shot down its own Su-35 with a surface-to-air missile by accident. With this Su-35, we see a big jump in price, with this aircraft costing at least $85 million, which is pretty much what you would expect out of a 5th generation fighter, except you don't get the 5th generation aspects like stealth. So definitely not a good value proposition here. The Su-35 gets a score of 3 for cost. Similar to the MiG-35, the Su-35's top speed is Mach 2.25. Pretty quick aircraft with a decent climb rate, again, of 55,000 feet per minute, giving the Su-35 an overall speed score of 8. For versatility, the Su-35 earns high marks with its abilities to perform in air-to-air combat and ground operations, with its 12 hard points, a decent combat range of 990 miles, and a pretty great ferry range reported at 2,800 miles. For versatility, the Su-35 gets an 8. For innovation, the Su-35 scores a 7 with all of the bells and whistles you would expect of a 4th generation fighter, including phased array radar, updated avionics, and thrust vectoring. For effectiveness, given the fact that we have seen confirmed kills in Ukraine, it has been a pretty difficult fighter for the Ukrainians to put up with. It gets an 8 for effectiveness. That gives the Su-35 an overall score of 7.45.
And since this is the first time I'm bringing up the Su-57 on my channel, I'm going to actually add it to our overall aircraft rankings. Now in the film, this aircraft is introduced to be a much far superior aircraft than the F-18 Super Hornet, and there are aspects that are certainly superior than the F-18, namely the fact that this is a 5th generation fighter, which means it incorporates stealth technology, whereas the F-18 only has limited stealth capabilities, only slightly better than the F-18 Hornet. Now something else that is actually on dramatic display is something called super maneuverability. Now this is actually an aspect of aircraft in Russia that is actually slightly better than what we have here in the United States. Super maneuverability is the concept where basically you can take the aircraft and change its direction on a dime. I mean, it is absolutely astounding to watch. However, the US has taken a totally different approach, and we basically haven't even strived towards this capability. But theoretically, it can be an incredible advantage in a slow, close air-to-air combat situation. Now, the reason that the US hasn't developed super maneuverability in their aircraft is because the US military has prioritized long standoff ranges, specifically beyond visual range. For instance, if you're in a dogfight between the F-22 and the Su-57, the F-22 is going to fire before it even sees the S-57. So you can do all the super maneuverability that you want, but if you're 20 miles out from the F-22 and the F-22 is already firing at you, then it really doesn't matter what kind of maneuvers you do. That being said, in this movie, we're actually able to see what's called super maneuverability in those Russian aircraft. And it's especially on display because you are actually in a close air-to-air, slow speed dogfight, which is pretty cool to see on film. And I actually really appreciate it because if you noticed in the previous Top Gun, they did not use any Russian aircraft because they actually used American aircraft, which they called a MiG, but it was actually just an F-5. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and put up the Su-57 on our aircraft ranking list. First, for cost, as all Russian aircrafts on this list, I don't really have the most reliable of data, but from what I can find, it seems to be about $100 million. So it gets about a 4, being pretty costly, but for what you're getting, it doesn't sound like that bad of a price. I don't really believe the price. And for speed, I give it an 8 because it does have super cruise maneuverabilities reportedly, and it actually is pretty quick. And for versatility, give it a 7 because it is designed to be a multi-role aircraft. It includes a fair amount of external and internal stores, and overall seems like a pretty decent aircraft based on stats alone. For innovation, it is a very innovative aircraft, especially for being the first 5th generation fighter to come out of Russia. But I will say, it does seem to lag behind some of the innovations of even the F-22, and it is much, much newer than the F-22 as well. And for effectiveness, unfortunately, it's going to have to get a 3. Because as much money as the Russians have thrown at this program, and as much as they like to tout this as the end-all be-all of 5th generation fighters, it actually hasn't proven itself in pretty much any theater. Even though there's only been a handful of these developed, some of them are still in testing phase, and the ones that are actually in operation are still not even being used, even where they would seem to be very important in a role such as Ukraine. Which begs the question, are they truly effective as they like to say? So overall, I'm giving this airplane a 5.95.
Now that we've analyzed the Russian aircraft, let's go ahead and dive into the US fighters.
Coming up first at number 12 is the AV-8B Harrier. And although this is a historic aircraft, as the Harrier was the first aircraft to be a jet and take off vertically and land vertically, but it has very limited capabilities. For instance, this is only one of the 2 fighter jets on this list that cannot reach supersonic speeds, coming in at the 2nd slowest of any aircraft on this list, with a top speed of only 673 miles an hour. The Harrier also sports a pretty limited combat range at about 350 miles. And although it has an average payload capacity of about 9,200 pounds, it only has 6 hardpoints. So for me, this was an easy last place. And next on our list, coming in at number 11, is the F-5 Tiger II. The F-5 has decidedly the least amount of thrust of any aircraft on this list, coming in at a total thrust of only about 7,000 pound force. And it also has the unfortunate title of being the slowest supersonic aircraft on this list. It also has the worst range of any of these aircraft, with a combat range of about 140 miles. But on the plus side, it does have a price tag of only a cool $2.1 million. The next aircraft coming up, I'm sure is going to make a lot of people upset with me, but coming in at number 10 is the A-10 Thunderbolt. The Warthog has been an absolute workhorse for the military. It has been one of the best ground support aircraft in history, which is why it might surprise a lot of people that it's this low on this list. However, the A-10 is not meant to be an advanced fighter. Although it is an incredible piece of engineering, built with incredible multiple redundancies, a titanium cockpit, all these features are made to make it one of the best ground support aircrafts out there. But the A-10 has the unfortunate dishonor of being the slowest aircraft at this list, clocking in a max speed of only about 439 miles an hour and an abysmal climb rate of only 6,000 feet per minute. The A-10 does have a pretty good payload capacity at about 16,000 pounds, and it's tied for first for number of hardpoints with 11 hardpoints, again lending itself to the incredible ground support aircraft that it is. But with a combat range like 290 miles an hour and a thrust to weight ratio of 0.36 and a top speed that's the lowest on this list, I'm sorry, I had to give it 10th place. Don't hate me. Now, deciding between the next two aircraft on this list was probably the most difficult decision that I had in the whole ranking process. If anything, some lists would probably just put these as a tie, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be a sellout. Coming in at number 9 is the F-18 Hornets. So I am putting 4 different variants of the F-18 Hornet in this section at slot number 9. However, I'm not including the Super Hornet. That's entirely another beast. So it was actually easy for me to put the F-18 above the previous aircraft because the F-18 really is a step up. It's the next caliber of fighter jet. The F-18 Hornet has a decent climb rate of about 50,000 feet per minute and has a max speed of Mach 1.8. And if you don't know what a Mach number is, make sure you check out my prior video where I explained what supersonic flight is and what a Mach number is. The F-18 is also an incredibly versatile aircraft, being that it was designed to be a carrier-borne aircraft and carry out an attack role as well for ground support. And like I alluded to earlier, number 8 is where it really starts to get tricky for me. Coming in at number 8, the F-16 Fighting Falcon. Now, before I recorded this video, I had actually asked my Instagram followers which aircraft they thought was better, and I got a pretty decent debate between the F-18 and the F-16. But ultimately, looking at the numbers, I had to go with the F-16. There are a few reasons why. The first being the F-16 has an incredible climb rate. The climb rate of the F-16 is 72,000 feet per minute, squarely placing it in first place. The F-16 also has a slightly faster top speed at Mach 2.05 compared to the F-18's 1.8. The thrust to weight ratio of the F-16 also edges out the F-18, coming in at 1.095. And it has a larger payload capacity, coming in at 17,000 pounds, compared to the F-18's 13,700 pounds. Overall, looking at the numbers, I just felt the F-16 was slightly more maneuverable, more agile, and a better nimble fighter than the F-18, which slightly edged it out for me. So I did get some feedback on my Instagram after I posed the question there that the F-18 is one of the best adversaries within visual range. However, I had to go with the F-16. It really was revolutionary. It was the very first aircraft that was actually designed to be dynamically unstable, making it incredibly maneuverable. But like I said, feel free to disagree with me down in the comments below. I'm an aerospace engineer. Like I said, I'm not a pilot, so I've never flown either of these aircraft. I don't have firsthand experience with them. I'm just going by the numbers here. As a Navy brat, I grew up adoring naval aviation. I still do. But while researching this video, I gained a renewed appreciation for how incredible the Air Force aircraft really are. Coming in at number 7 is the F-15 Eagle. The F-15 is tied for the fastest aircraft on this list, coming in at a top speed of Mach 2.5. It's a twin-engine aircraft with each of those engines putting out 14,590 pounds of thrust, and a respectable thrust to weight ratio of 1.07. It is the single greatest combat range of any of the aircraft on this list, coming at over 1,200 miles. Coming in at number 6 should be no surprise to anyone, but its younger brother, the F-15E Strike Eagle. This re-engined F-15 has the same top speed of about Mach 2.5, but gives out a thrust of over 17,800 pounds. It does take a small hit on its combat range, coming in at 791 miles as opposed to the 1,200 of the previous variants. However, it still comes in at second best on the entire list. Couple that with the fact that it gives the second best total thrust of any of these aircraft, coming in at 35,000 pounds. Coming in at number 5 is the aircraft I had dreamed ever since I was a little kid that I would be able to fly in, but my hopes were dashed when I realized that I did not. have 20/20 vision in both eyes. The F-18 Super Hornet. The F-18 sports brand new engines, increasing its thrust and allowing it to have even more hardpoints, clocking in at 11 hardpoints. It puts up respectable numbers for top speed, maneuverability, and all those other metrics. However, what really sets it apart is its newly reduced radar cross-section, its avionics, and its versatility. In fact, the reason that I put the F-18 above the F-15 exclusively is because the F-15 was only designed to be an air superiority fighter, while the F-18 was designed with a variety of missions in mind. At its core, the F-18 Super Hornet is a carrier-borne aircraft, and as such, it has to perform a variety of tasks, such as attack missions, fighter missions, air-to-air combat roles. It really has to be a jack of all trades. For me, that's what really put it above the F-15 in my mind. And if you're very familiar with military fighter jets, you may be asking yourself, are there still even 4 more fighter jets out there? And to answer that question, coming in at number 4, 3, and 2 are the F-35 Lightning. The reason that the F-35 comes in 3 different places is because it comes in the A, B, and C variant, which all have very different capabilities. Coming in at number 4 is the F-35B, the Marine variant. Although the Marine variant is the only one that has STOVL capability, or short takeoff vertical landing capability, it takes a huge hit on range because of it. The F-35B has the shortest ferry range of any of the aircraft on this list, coming on only 900 miles. Meanwhile, the combat range is not much better, coming in at only 550 miles. And that's the reason that I put it below the other variants of the F-35. However, the F-35 as a whole is still clearly a top-tier aircraft. All of the F-35 variants feature thrust vectoring, all-aspect stealth, advanced avionics, and a payload capacity that allows this aircraft to stand out above the crowd. The F-35B, however, has the lowest payload capacity, coming in at only 15,000 pounds, while the other F-35 variants come in at 18,000 pounds of payload capacity. Coming in at number 3 is the F-35A, the Air Force variant of the F-35. The reason that I put the F-35A here is because although it does have almost the same exact combat range as the F-35C, the Navy variant, it severely lacks in its versatility. Coming in at number 2, the F-35C, the Navy variant, is able to be a carrier-borne aircraft. In other words, it can fold its wings and it can deploy and land from an aircraft carrier. This greatly enhances the F-35's ability to perform a variety of combat roles, such as attack missions and air-to-air combat. And finally, without any further ado, we have the single greatest aircraft in the single greatest air force in the entire world, the F-22 Raptor. Should be no surprise here for anyone who's familiar with aviation, because the F-22 is unparalleled. It has by far the best maneuverability, thrust vectoring, all aspect stealth. It was the first 5th generation fighter ever. It has an incredible climb rate of 69,000 feet per minute. It has a max speed of about 2.25. The F-22 has the lowest aspect ratio on this list, making it one of the most maneuverable aircraft ever conceived. But its total thrust is what really sets the F-22 apart. It has the greatest thrust of any fighter jet ever, coming in at over 52,000 pounds of thrust.
Now that we've analyzed all the US fighter jets, let's go ahead and dive into the Chinese fighter jets.
So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into the rankings of all the Chinese operational fighter jets. So in order from oldest to newest aircraft, we have the Chengdu J7 coming in at about $25 million reportedly, giving it a cost score of 7. As for speed, it also gets a 7, coming in at a top speed of Mach 2, having a low climb rate, but given the fact that it's pretty old, this doesn't hurt it as much. And the J7 scores scores a 4 for versatility given its low amount of hardpoints, its relatively short range of about 530 miles, and for innovation it scores a 3 since it's basically a copy of the MiG-21 with a few modifications. And for effectiveness it scores a 5 due to the fact that it has been a cost-effective option for a lot of foreign militaries outside of China. It also actually happens to be the only operational Chinese fighter jet that has seen any air-to-air combat, with 1 air-to-air kill and 0 losses, so technically it's undefeated. This gives the J7 an overall score of 4.40. Next up we have the J8, but I couldn't find a reliable cost estimate, so I'll just have to give this a 5. For speed it gets a respectable 7, being pretty much on par with the J7. For versatility it scores a 5 given the fact that they increased the number of hardpoints from the previous J7, increased the range a little bit, the climb rate and the ceiling of the aircraft. And for effectiveness it scores a 4 as it hasn't proven to be quite as hardy as its predecessor, the J7. That gives the J8 an overall score of 4.65, slightly edging it over the J7. Next we have the Shenyang JH7. Again, I couldn't find reliable data as for our cost, so again I'll have to give it a 5. For speed it's going to get 4 since it's below average and slightly slower than its near peer foes. For versatility it's going to have to get a 3, given the fact that it only has 6 hardpoints, extremely limited range, a fairly low ceiling, and a pretty low climb rate as well. For innovation it gets a 4 due to the fact that it mimics many of the capabilities of the F-111, except in a much worse way and a long time after the advent of the F-111. And lastly, for effectiveness it gets a 3 due to the fact that it suffered severe technological mishaps even from the very first flight. That gives the Shenyang JH7 a pretty bad score of 3.50. Next up we have the Shenyang J11, coming in at the cost score of 6 due to the fact that it's a fairly affordable aircraft for its price and capabilities. For speed it gets a solid 8 because of its top speed of Mach 2.35 and a pretty good respectable climb rate of 59,000 feet per minute. For versatility it gets a 7 due to its 10 hard points, much improved range from other aircraft in their fleet, high thrust to weight ratio, and great maneuverability. For innovation it gets a 6 since it pretty much is an Su-27, but they did add some slight modifications, especially in the J11B. Although the J11 still hasn't seen combat, it has proven to be a pretty reliable platform, giving it a score for effectiveness of 7. This gives the Shenyang J11 an overall score of 6.75. Next we have the Chengdu J10 scoring an 8 for cost, a 7 for speed, being a pretty quick aircraft with a great thrust to weight ratio. For versatility, the J10 gets a score of 6, being slightly above average for things such as its 11 hardpoints. For innovation it gets a 5, being a fairly decent aircraft, but nothing really pushing the envelope of aerospace engineering. And for effectiveness, given its high number of hardpoints, its high thrust to weight ratio, and fairly decent climb rates, one would expect it to perform pretty well in combat scenarios. That gives the Chengdu J10 an overall score of 6.15. Next up we have the Shenyang J15. J15 scores a 9 for speed, being the fastest aircraft in the Chinese fleet and having the best climb rate of any of the Chinese fighter jets. For versatility it gets a 7 because of its 12 hardpoints and the fact that it's a carrier-borne aircraft, although it gets a 4 for innovation due to the fact that it relies so heavily on foreign technology. And for effectiveness it gets a 3 due to its severe operational challenges. Another telltale sign of the fact that this hasn't been an effective platform for them is only 6 years after its first flight they're already talking about completely replacing it. Specifically for the fact that it's such a heavy aircraft, this severely limits its payload capacity when it's launching from a carrier. Next we have the Shenyang J16 coming at a score of 5 for cost, again because I haven't found the cost. For speed it gets an 8, being a pretty quick aircraft, again coming in at a top speed of Mach 2. For versatility it gets a 7 due to the fact that it has 12 hardpoints, a decent payload capacity, and is incredibly maneuverable, similar to the J11. For innovation it gets a 4, again because it is such a new aircraft and it really hasn't advanced anything, relying so heavily on the foreign technology as we discussed previously. For effectiveness it gets a 5, being a decent aircraft so far, nothing too crippling to report operational wise, lives, but again, it hasn't been able to really prove itself either. And finally, we have the pride of the Chinese air fleet, their only 5th generation fighter, and probably the best 5th generation fighter outside the United States. Coming in at a price tag of over $110 million, that gives it a cost score of 3. It gets a speed score of 8, being the fact that it has a top speed of Mach 2. For versatility, it gets an 8 for its stealth capabilities and its 6 internal hardpoints. It has the best range of any fighter jet in the Chinese air fleet, coming in at 1,200 miles for combat range. For innovation, the J-10 gets an 8 due to the fact that we are actually starting to see what looks like China developing its own 5th generation fighter, and one that's actually seemingly more capable than its counterpart in Russia, making it the 3rd country to ever bring a 5th generation fighter to production. For effectiveness, it gets a 7 due to its reduced radar cross-section and the capabilities previously mentioned. That gives the J-20 an overall score of 7.50.
Now let's dive into the European manufactured fighter jets.
Which brings us to our first aircraft on our list, the Dassault Mirage 2000. Now the Mirage 2000 was designed as a lightweight replacement to the Mirage 3, but in my opinion, it really doesn't bring any new advancements or updates in technology, no leaps in innovation. So really, it kind of disappointed in that regard. It's a fair price at about $30 million, giving it a score of 7. A top speed of Mach 2.2 earns it a score of 7 on speed. Its 9 hard points and about 2,000 miles of ferry range earn it a decent score of 7 for versatility. But as I mentioned earlier, its innovation leaves something to be desired, giving it only a score of 5. It is, however, the most produced aircraft on our list today at over 600 units produced. It has a wide variety of operators across the globe. It, however, doesn't have as much air combat history, scoring only 1 air-to-air kill and 1 ground loss, giving it an effectivity score of 7. Next up, also from Dassault, its first flight was in 1986, the Dassault Rafale. This one's primary operators are France and Greece and is a quantum leap in price at over $115 million. However, you're getting a lot more bang for your buck. And that price tag unfortunately earns it only a 3 on cost. And although its top speed is slightly slower than the Mirage 2000, it has a top cruise speed of 1.4, meaning it has super cruise capabilities, which means it gets a higher speed score at 8. While researching these statistics, I was blown away by the numbers of the Rafale. The 3rd best combat range of any aircraft on the fighter jet list. 14 hardpoints, which is the most of any fighter jet I've seen. By the numbers, this should be the most versatile fighter jet I've seen. I started looking at the technology. I noticed that it had a phased array radar, it had super cruise, it was checking all of the boxes, but then I started to look a little bit closer. Although it does currently have a phased array radar, this was a later modification. And unfortunately, one thing that opened my eyes was I found out that in 2002, the Rafale was actually prevented from conducting air-to-ground operations for literally 5 years. 5 years where the French Air Force needed the Rafale to conduct air-to-ground operations where it just couldn't. And so unfortunately, I had to give versatility a score of 7. So as I mentioned earlier, the phased array radar and many of the advancements on the Rafale were only added in later modifications. So unfortunately for innovation, I also had to give the Rafale a 7. It has had a fairly successful production run at over 200 units and has sold pretty well to various nations. However, hasn't had any air-to-air combat history to speak of. So scores a 6 for effectivity. Next up, we have our Swedish friends with the Saab JAS-39 Gripen. Inside of Europe, this aircraft flies for the Czech Republic, Sweden, the UK, Hungary, and a variety of countries outside of Europe as well. What I love about this aircraft is it's literally a Kia for air forces. And it's exactly what you would get for quality for a cheap airplane for air forces that can't afford higher quality. But it's still stylish and some assembly required. So coming in at about $30 million, the Gripen gets an 8 for cost. It has a respectable top speed of Mach 2, giving it a speed score of 7. The Gripen's 10 hard points and subpar combat range give it a 6 for versatility. And just like your run-of-the-mill IKEA furniture, it's nothing to write home about for innovation. It's pretty much as standard as they come. It gets a 5. average. And again, no combat history here to speak of, but it has sold decently well for Saab and has proven to be a good production aircraft and a great budget aircraft for countries that may not be able to afford all the bells and whistles. So next up we have the BAE Harrier 2, but we've actually already ranked that one in our US aircraft fighter jet rankings. So I'm not going to go over too much detail about that one, but I will recap the score for you real quick. For cost, it gets a 6. For speed, it gets a 3. Versatility, it got a 5. For innovation, it got a 7. For effectivity, it got a 4. And its overall score was a 5.2. And like I said, if you want to learn more about that, make sure you check out my video talking about the US fighter jets ranked. Last but certainly not least was the Eurofighter Typhoon. This was a multinational design effort with the likes of Leonardo, BAE, and Airbus, which were Italian, British, and French companies respectively. The primary operators of the Typhoon are now the UK, Germany, Italy, and Spain. The Typhoon definitely comes with a price tag at over $124 million, giving it a score of 2 on cost. But it definitely is fast, and it has Super Cruise as well, so it gets an 8 on speed. For versatility, it has 13 hardpoints and is able to perform a variety of functions, from air superiority to air-to-ground operations, so it gets an 8 for versatility as well. Not only does this aircraft have Super Cruise, but it also has a phased array radar and has a reduced radar cross-section. This is certainly one of the most advanced aircraft in the world. And although it's not a 5th generation aircraft, nor is it all aspect stealth, it incorporates radar absorbing materials, known as RAM, to reduce its radar cross-section. This is why some would classify this aircraft as a 4th plus generation instead of just a 4th generation aircraft.
So now that we've done all the analyses and all the operational fighter and attack aircraft, let's see how they rank against each other on their ultimate ranking list. At the bottom of our list, we have the Su-25, followed by the JH-7, the Chengdu J-7, then the Shenyang J-8, followed by the Harrier, the Shenyang J-15, the F-5 Tiger II, the Su-34, the MiG-35, the Su-24, the A-10 Thunderbolt, the J-16, the Su-57, the J-10, the Gripen, the MiG-29, the Mirage 2000, the Rafale, the J-11, the F-18 Hornet, the Su-30 in 21st place. Now we cracked the top 20 with the MiG-31, the Eurofighter Typhoon, the Su-35, the J-20, the Su-27, the F-16, the F-15E, the F-18 Super Hornet, the F-15 Eagle, followed by all 3 F-35 Lightning variants, and up top the F-22 Raptor. My ranking videos always seem to generate a lot of conversation in the comments section, so let me know how wrong you think I am down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this video. It was a lot of work to make. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found some value in it. If you did find any value in it, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for watching this video, and Godspeed.